So today we will be talking about the business processes underlying the third module topic. If we have any time left, I will be able to answer your questions, but first we need to go through these practice test requirements and see what needs to be implemented in this case. So this week's topic is called access rights. And the general idea behind this is that not every users are created equal, meaning that some of them should have more access than others. For two reasons, basically. One of them would be that different users perform different tasks. And depending on your position inside the company, you might need or not need some pieces of functionality present in the application that you work with. So, for example, you're an accountant and you don't have to even know about something related to warehouse and inventory and stuff like that, or maybe HR things, right? So your area of expertise and area of responsibility is narrower than the entire application. And one reason to limit your access would be that you just don't need everything you need, only what you need. And this is what you should have access to. Another reason would be that sometimes we don't want users to see some data. For example, it might somehow violate other people's rights. The simplest example would be that according to company policy, it depends on the company, of course, but for example, according to company policy, employees shouldn't know each other's salary, okay? So this is a sensitive data. I have my reason to hide it from people, and maybe I want them to know their own salary, but nothing else. So I want this data to be hidden, and this is a good reason for limiting the user's access. Or maybe I don't trust my employees for some reason, and I don't want them to break something or to perform some malicious actions with my data. And it's actually quite reasonable concern, because if my users work with my cloud solution from the internet, I have no idea who they are, and I definitely want to hide many things from them and limit their ability to break my system. So this is what we use access rights for, and the third module of senior developer training course is about that topic. And let's just go through the requirements and discuss what needs to be done. So first of all, there is a thing that is called administrative rights. Access rights are divided into several different categories, more specifically into three categories. And one of those categories is about rights that is applicable to the application as a whole, right? So you have your entire application, and there are things you can or cannot do with the entire application. For example, there is a right to launch, to run a specific client, like thin client or a thick client or web client. It's applicable to the entire application because you're running a client. It's not about some specific data. Another example of these application-wide access rights would be the right to add new users, or the right to make some changes in the application. And one of those application-wide rights is called administrative right. And basically, it encapsulates a bunch of different rights related to the administrative activities. So adding roles, adding users, opening the designer, stuff like that. So this is what this first task is about. And what you need to understand about 1C Enterprise when it comes to the access rights, access limitation, it switches one mode to another, very different mode, as soon as you add your first user. So when you start building your application, it's reasonable to guess that you don't have any users. You don't want to restrict your own access to the application. You just want to write your code and build your metadata structure. So probably you don't have users added while you're working on the implementation of your application functionality. And in this mode, the rule that 1C Enterprise follows is everybody is allowed to do everything. So whoever is able to open the application has access to everything that's inside. So nothing is limited, nothing is restricted, everybody can do anything. Then, as soon as you add your first user, the mode changes dramatically. And from this point on, you need anything that is allowed. Anything that is not allowed explicitly is disallowed. So you cannot do anything that you have an explicit permission to do. And those explicit permissions are your access rights that are set up in the designer. So for this reason, the administrative right has very special role, very special position. When you add a first user and therefore close access to everything that is not explicitly allowed, you might lose the access to the designer and to the access rights. So you won't be able to change anything. You will lose your own access to the application. This issue should be prevented. So 1C Enterprise warns you that if you change your rights in a way that none of the users have administrative access anymore, 1C Enterprise won't allow you to do that. Will warn you that you're about to lose access to your own system. So please don't do that. So when you add your first user, you need to give them administrative rights. And this is what this is about. The second part are about accessing the data on a metadata objects level. So what it means is that you have different metadata objects like documents, sales, purchases, and stuff like that, products catalogs, users catalog. And you might want to set up your rights in a way that specific users have access to specific metadata objects and not to other metadata objects. I almost forget to explain the difference between users and roles and difference and how they are connected. So you could build a system given specific users specific rights. Nothing's wrong about that, but it would be much more difficult because there are usually groups of users that perform the similar tasks or have the similar responsibilities, and therefore their rights are the same. So they should have the same access rights, all users belonging to this group. And this group of rights is called a role. It's called a role in 1C Enterprise, and usually it's called the same in other development platforms. And everywhere where you use access rights, there is a notion of a role. So role is just basically a group of users that can be empty. You can create a role without any users in it. So you create a role, you specify its access rights, and then just say that this user belongs to this role or to several roles, because users can belong to any number of roles, actually. It all depends on how you design your system and more specifically, your access rights system. Okay, so when I say that user has access or don't have access, what I mean is that the user belongs to a role that specifies these rules, these access rules. So database access rights and interactive rights are both belong to the metadata object rights. So you just tell, okay, this metadata object is accessible and this one is not, and so on and so forth. And in 1C Enterprise, you actually can go to any level of the metadata object structure, because every metadata object, as you know, has some like tree-like structure, because it can have like bunch of attributes and then tabular sections that has bunch of other attributes. There are forms that belong to metadata objects and stuff like that, templates, so different pieces of data that gives this metadata object its functionality. And you can limit access to any of those small things that live inside of the metadata object. For example, you can give access to the entire metadata object, or you can select several attributes that user has access to, and others won't be accessible for him. And this group of rights is divided into two separate areas, and they are called database access rights and interactive rights. And the difference between them is that when you have database access rights, you basically can work with the data that are stored inside of the database. For example, read them. But it does not necessarily mean that after reading you can view them, because this is a different thing. And the difference is that you might be able to read information, register data, and then process them in some way, group them, sum them up, and show them as a report, or use them to calculate something else and put it into a different register. For example, when I post the sales document, I want to adjust my inventory balance according to the sales. Okay, so I sold some amount of something and I want to subtract this amount from the balance of the accumulation register. But it does not mean that I can see this balance. I might be allowed to process it in some way, change it, but it does not mean that I can see it, because that may be above my pay grade, or it may be a secret for some reason. For example, I might be an accountant that calculates salary for other people. So I have to be able to calculate it, but it does not mean that I necessarily can see it. I might calculate and don't know what numbers there are. So these are different things. And once enterprise makes this difference, so for each metadata object or its part, its attribute, you can set up database access rights, and separately you can set up the interactive rights, viewing rights, basically. So this is an important distinction which is used in this practice test. When it comes to the types of rights, we have different metadata objects. There are, of course, a right to read or see. There are two different rights. A right to edit, right to delete, right to add a new item. So things like that, all kinds of operations that you can think of, there are inside of the access rights system. And one of the rights that is important to understand is the interactive delete right. So the thing about interactive deletion is that once enterprise does not check the consistency of your data, so there is nothing inside the platform that prevents you from deleting some object that other objects refer to as a reference to this object. For example, there is a product in the products catalog, and there are a bunch of documents and registers that store a reference to this product. And if I have interactive deletion rights, I can just delete this product. And what will happen is all those documents who store the reference to this object will lose it. So they will show that object is no longer available, and it will look like that. So object not found. So there is a reference, but it points at nothing. There is no object with this reference in the system anymore. So interactive deletion should be treated very cautiously, and probably there should be very limited number of users who has this right. Okay, so there is also a task about implementing some simple checks in terms of data integrity, that we cannot delete things that other objects refer to. Okay, the privileged mode. Sometimes you want to allow source code run under a specific user to have bigger access than the user has. For example, again, the same example with the inventory balance and the sales document. I, as a user who works with the system, might not have direct access to the inventory accumulation register, meaning that I cannot just open this register and start editing it manually. I might not even have access to see what's inside of this register, but I work with a document that accesses this register and needs to perform changes in there. So basically, the default mode for the application to work with anything inside of it is that it knows what user works right now, and it applies its access restrictions or access rights to every action. So whatever application does, it considers itself to be this user. And if this user does not have access to some piece of data or some piece of functionality, then platform does not allow that. But sometimes we need to give more permission to some pieces of code. And this is when we use a privileged mode. We just turn it on, perform the operation that needs more access than current user has, and then we switch the privileged mode off. So as simple as that, and hopefully it's clear. The example that we use here is about the registering the time worked by a cashier. The idea is that a cashier shouldn't have a direct access to this data, meaning that he or she cannot just open the list of worked shifts and change the time in any way. Cashiers don't have direct access to this data, but they do have this separate form that has two buttons: start my shift and finish my shift. It's actually the same button that just changes the text on it. And it's like a timer. When I enter my workplace, I switch it on. When I leave at the end of the day, I switch it off, and the time should be registered automatically. And the code that registers this time should be executed in the privileged mode, because otherwise it won't have access to this data, because users that run this code don't. So this is what it is about. And the safe mode is the direct opposite of the privileged mode, and basically it disables the privileged mode when you need it to. So there are some big chunk of code that is run in the privileged mode. Actually, it's not that uncommon of a case, because you can even create a common module and check the flag that says that the entire module is privileged. So all the procedures inside of this module will be executed in a privileged mode. Everything that's inside of it. It can be big chunks of code, and you might want to secure some pieces of this code. So don't allow it to run in privileged mode, because it will be too much vulnerability for some reason. And there is a good example in our video lessons about the types of vulnerability that can occur. And the example is that you might allow a user to write some code in a user mode. For example, it can be some formula that calculates bonuses or calculates the prices of something. So you want to add more flexibility to your solution, and you introduce some way for users to write something like a code or a formula. And the malicious users can exploit this to write some code that gives them access to data they are not supposed to see. So this is a kind of a place where you want to stop privileged mode, disable it, then run this not safe, dangerous piece of code, and then switch the privileged mode back on. So basically, a safe mode is an antidote to the privileged mode, and you should use it whenever you think that something wrong can happen. Okay, and the third type of the access rights restrictions that we have in the ONCE Enterprise is called record level security. So basically, if you think about the access to data in terms of tables and columns and rows, this makes it very simple. So metadata object and its structure, it's basically either tables or columns inside of the tables. And this is the second type of the access that we discussed. But there are also rows inside of the tables. So for example, if you're talking about products catalog, there are product name, product price, maybe product units of measurement, brand, and so on and so on. These are columns, and these are set up on the metadata objects level. But there are also rows: Coca-Cola, iPhone, table, glass, something like that. So different products inside of the same catalog. And sometimes you want to limit access to specific rows inside of the table. This is what RLS, or record level security, is about. And it's done a little bit differently, because you cannot point at a specific objects at the design time and say that, okay, these objects are out of limits for this role. Users of this role shouldn't see them, because there are no objects. They will appear when users start working with the system. So instead of explicit access rights setup, you specify rules. And the rules usually look like an addition to the SQL query. So you can think of it, and it's actually very close to the way it really works. You can think of RLS as an additional condition that just added to any query that somehow touches this object. So whatever condition is there because application adds it. For example, user scrolls through the list of products and clicks next page. So there is a SQL query that goes to the products table and fetches the next screen worth of products, and platform automatically just adds this RLS condition to the query. So you don't see things that you're not supposed to see. And the tricky part here is that we want this condition to be about a user. We are limiting a user's access, so we want to know who those users are. And therefore, we somehow need to pass this user ID or something inside of the query, and the query should understand what it means. And the problem is that the user list, the system user list, which you fill out in the designer when you create new users, or you can do it by writing some code, but again, the users will be stored in the same list. So this list is not the table of the database, because for the security reasons, it's stored separately. It's basically encrypted and stored in a way that nobody can directly read it as a SQL table. But at the same time, you need to somehow tell the platform which user is working right now, and therefore which access he or she should have. The way it's implemented all across the 1C enterprise applications is you just create a catalog, just create a user's catalog, and you bind it, you map each system user that lives in the 1C enterprise secret list of users. You just bind it to your catalog that you created separately. And the way you do that is by using user ID, because each user has its own ID inside of the 1C enterprise users list. So you just take this ID, you put it into your catalog, and this is how you know how you map your users to the system users. And then at the startup of the application, you know which user logged in into your application. So you look him up in the system catalog, you grab his ID, and then you go to your catalog. You find this user there. This is how you know who is working now. And you remember this user, and then you use this reference to create those additional conditions to the queries that the platform sends to the database. And the example here is the following. We need to create the user's catalog. We need to map system user to the user from our catalog. And then we are limiting users' ability to edit their own data. Basically, it's a simple example, and the idea is that as soon as you created this new catalog with all the users, you should somehow restrict which user can edit. For example, I can edit my own record. I want to change my address or my phone number or the pronouns I prefer, or my gender or anything else, or my legal name, but I shouldn't be able to do the same with other users' data, okay? So this is the task that we solve here. And the second task from the same topic, which is RLS, record level security, is to limit users' access to users' wages or salary, to how much money each user earned. So I can and I should see how much I earned. For example, Agnes Blue should see her own earnings, and that's just reasonable, but she shouldn't be able to see other people's earnings. And this is what we need to implement. Okay, and this is it.